Welcome to Painting with Carmia. I am going to introduce a little bit of some of the process that I used for doing the line art for this picture because it's a little bit different to what I've done in the past. In the past, I have primarily used, actually I do have them right here. I have primarily used manga pens. I prefer to use the school nib and the maru nib for doing my inking, and I've used that the same way that I would for black and white illustrations. But I'm starting to find that I don't really like how that interacts on watercolor paper because of the texture of the paper. It both scratches a lot against the paper and can really damage the pen nibs. And on top of that, I find that the sharpness of the pens doesn't always interact nicely with the paper. It can be way too thick. It digs deep in, the ink digs really deep into the paper, and you wind up with line art which takes a long time to dry. I've sometimes taken 48 hours to dry, which I think is really excessive. So one thing I tried, I didn't remember to bring all of them with me, whoops, but I have a bunch of different pens. I have a few Sakura micron pens. I have these All-Tool graphic liners, which are different because they actually have a metal nib instead of a felt nib, and I also have Copic multi-liners, which have a better quality felt nib than the Copics, than the Sakuras, at least in my opinion. And so I did an experiment. Now excuse how rough this is. And I tested a bunch of different types of those pens on this paper, and I was really pleased with the results. It's very soft and faded, and I like that for watercolor. I'm trying more and more to move away from using really thick, heavy layers and do very soft layers on watercolor. Okay, if I layer it like this, I think you can see this is fairly thin. This is a pretty thick pen though. I didn't bring one of the thinnest pens with me. Here, 005 should be not thinner apparently. Here. And this is not the felt. The felt is even thinner. Now, if you compare that on, do I have any here? I am so sorry. I'm just like, what? This is just a mixed media paper, and I think you can see that this pen looks much thicker. Compare this to this. Let's do like this. Now, this is of course a thicker pen, but you can see how much thicker and darker that looks. And then imagine that with a much thinner pen. So you get much softer results from these pens, which I've never liked for regular illustrations when you're using it on a textured watercolor paper. So it's actually pretty good. And the paint also, I'm also using the rougher side of the paper. I didn't always do that in the past, but I've decided now that I do like doing that, or at least that I want to experiment with it. You can see that it's just softer, and I want it not to stand out quite so much in contrast to the actual painting at the end. And one thing I wanted to also talk about was I finally, after so many years, got a light box. This was the original pencil sketch I did. I just folded the paper so it would be the same size as the watercolor paper. This is just regular printer copy paper. I did a rough sketch and then I used a light box to transfer it. It has a USB plug, so I can't plug it in. There's no port here where I record, but it's bright enough that with thick watercolor paper like this, you will be able to see the line art through and then trace it and get a very clean tracing of your art. So there we are. I just wanted to talk about that because that is something that I'm doing a bit differently, and I thought it would be interesting to talk about why I tried something different. If anyone is like, knows this paper I use, the Balcon watercolor paper, does come in blocks which are glued down so that you don't have to worry about the paper warping. However, you can't do that and then also use the tracing light box. So there you are. A lot of watercolor kind of assumes that you're going to be doing freehand watercolor, and I'm like, no, I don't, I hate that. So there you are. Okay, at this point, the one thing I'm going to be doing first, as always, is the character's skin tones. So I'm just going to get the paints that I like for that and mix up both the main skin tone and then, well, I don't mix up the main skin tone, but get that ready and then also mix up a shadow for it. So this is a nice skin tone, and then I'm also going to get a little bit of this for a darker version, and then I'm also going to add a bit of brown to this one to create a shadow. So there we have 3 different varieties for skin tone. Here's a little bit of brown, and that will be a shadowy area. Okay, there we are. Very simple. And I'm going to be not doing wet on wet for this part, I think, simply because it's such a small area. I cannot imagine that being a good idea. Wet on wet is much better when you're doing wider areas of a painting. Oh, this brush needs to be replaced. It's getting damaged. Now, I'm not going to be talking for a lot of this painting, but I always like to introduce a little bit of what I'm doing and what techniques I'm using and things like that. So here we are. At this point, we just need to let this dry a little bit before adding shadows. If I try to add shadows too soon, they just won't work. They'll just blend into the main paint and you won't get any results out of it that are worthwhile. Okay, here we are. I mean, you do get some blending there that kind of works, but you can see it did very quickly start to disperse. So that's a problem if you want to have more precision. Okay, this part can be a little faded because we have a transparent fan over that whole area, so no need to make that part too dark. It'll be covered by red in future. And in fact, I'm going to be trying, while it's still lightly damp, to then add these shadows and basically just do one layer, so to speak. 1.5 layers. I'm trying really hard to lean into the transparency of watercolor more and to not overlayer it and overwork it. So the one thing I will come back to do later is add a little bit of a pink blush to the characters' faces in certain areas. That I think you do need to wait and do that a little later on.